Good afternoon. Come on, you can't be tired already. Good afternoon. And welcome to Public Health Grand Rounds at the Aspen Institute. We're delighted to have you here for this very special session on an always hot topic, our relationship with food and how to navigate it for better health. But with GLP-1 drugs now in the mix, this issue is, I think you would agree, hotter than ever. And with summer upon us, and ice cream, one of my very favorite foods, always on my mind, an exploration of this relationship could not be more timely. I am Ruth Katz, Executive Director of the Health Medicine Society program at the Aspen Institute. Health Medicine and Society is the founding and ongoing sponsor of Public Health Grand Rounds at the Aspen Institute. This is actually our 9th year at it. Now, as many of you know, Grand Rounds is a time-honored feature of medicine designed to keep clinicians up to date about scientific and medical advances and to promote excellence in research and practice. Public Health Grand Rounds borrows from that tradition to advance knowledge about the cutting-edge public health or population health issues of the day. Today's program takes up one of those public health issues, which, as I have noted, has been with us, I think, forever. Our relationship with food, which of course involves many individual variables, has always been tricky. But with the advent of the new class of GLP-1 weight loss drugs, this complicated relationship has become even more complex. To help us unpack and understand all this, we have with us today Dr. David Kessler, author of the new New York Times bestseller, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. A pediatrician by training and author of several other Times bestsellers, Dr. Kessler served as commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He was chief science officer of the White House COVID-19 response team and co-led Operation Warp Speed under President Joe Biden. Dr. Kessler has also been dean of the schools of medicine at Yale and the University of California at San Francisco. In conversation with Dr. Kessler is Dr. Vivek Murthy, who served as both the 19th and 21st U.S. Surgeon General. As America's doctor, Dr. Murthy widened the lens through which we understand forces that shape our health and well-being, including the critical importance of human connection. His New York Times bestseller, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World, drills down on the nation's epidemic of loneliness, and his recent parting prescription to America lays out a vision for rebuilding community as the key to health, happiness, and fulfillment. An outstanding lineup, I think you would agree. But credentials aside, this is a very personal public health grand round session for me to introduce. I actually have known both David and Vivek each for a very long time. David, way before he became the David Kessler, now viewed as one of the nation's leading public health officials. And Vivek, much younger than either David or me, since he was a student at Yale Medical School, while I served in the dean's office during David's tenure there. It was clear even then Vivek would go on to make tremendous contributions to the nation's public health. So for me, this is kind of old home week or maybe old home hour. Indeed, really quite special. A great honor to have old friends and current colleagues join us for today's event. So thank you both for being here. And I think it's really fair to say, truly, on behalf, I know it sometimes sounds trite, but on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you both for your service. And now, before turning things over to Vivek, a few housekeeping notes. As you can see, I think you can see, we are videotaping the program. It will be up on the Health Medicine Society website within 24 to 48 hours, so you can watch it again and again and again and again, or share it with friends and colleagues. Our interview will run about, our conversation will run about 35 minutes or so, after which we will open up the room to take your questions and comments. Please wait for a microphone before speaking, and then do introduce yourself and state your affiliation before asking your question. Finally, time is tight for the Q&A portion of the program, and we do want to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So please, I say this with every grand rounds, please be brief. get directly to your question or comment. We want to get to as many people as we can. With that, thanks again to David and Vivek for taking time from their very busy schedules to participate in Grand Rounds. Thanks also to Katja and Hugo of the Health Maintenance Society team for their logistical help. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us. It's great to have you here. And with Vivek, the Aspen stage, once again, is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you all for being here today. This is going to be a wonderful conversation because we have David Kessler with us. And David has a beautiful track record of showing up on issues that are of great importance to the country. He did this on tobacco when he was FDA commissioner. He's done this on issues related to weight and obesity, long preceding this current book. He certainly was one of those forces during COVID-19 as well. And I got to see that up front, actually working very closely with David during COVID, both before and during our time in the administration together. Many of our calls on COVID took place at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 7 a.m., around the clock really. And that really reflects David's commitment to service. And we're going to come back to that actually toward the end. But David also, as Ruth mentioned, was my dean in medical school when I was a student. And so I have been both inspired by him, from a young age, and now have the great privilege of calling him not just somebody I admire, but a dear friend as well. So I'm excited for this conversation that we're going to have. David, I want to start with the premise of the book and really the motivation behind the book. You came out of the administration in the throes of COVID. One could have said that if there was a betting market on what book you would have written, that would have been about your experiences with COVID and with the government response. But you chose to write a different book. Can you tell us a little bit about why you focused on this subject?
First, thank you for doing this. I think this is the first time in the last number of years I've seen you out of uniform. There's a part of me that wishes you were back in uniform. But thank you very much for doing this. COVID was an intense period of time, fair?
Yes.
It was an intense period of time, I think, for everybody. I don't think we fully have grasped, what we went through. Right? A million people died during the pandemic. If I told you we were going to be locked down or, change how we work, change how we go to school, for several years, no one would have really just fathomed that happened. And I think we're somewhat still having fully come to grasp with the intensity of that period in our lives. And I certainly wasn't, when we signed up, I knew there was going to be, the epidemiology was looking pretty bleak January 20th, 2021, as far as the peak of the pandemic. I didn't realize we'd still have, 4 or 5 strains and cycles and waves. This went on way longer than we ever thought, right? But we got through it. We got to the other side. We did 676 million vaccines free within 5 miles. But, I found myself at the end of that period, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, talking 2 o'clock, 3, in the morning. I found myself literally 40 pounds heavier. And I had written books on overeating, and I still couldn't control it. So when I left, I thought I would tackle an easy subject, compared to COVID. I wanted to understand the mystery of weight. Why if I could, do these jobs, I still couldn't control my weight. What was that mystery of weight? And during that period of trying to understand that question, we saw dramatic data come out about these drugs, and in fact, not about weight, but the real reduction in cardiovascular events, more technically the MACE, right? And this was marked effects on improvements in health, even for people who are on lipid-lowering drugs, right? And so there was a lot coming out while I was writing this, and all of a sudden, it sort of evolves. In my head, this is not about weight. This really is about chronic disease, right? This is about the major killers, and I always knew weight wasn't good for me. I always knew it was a risk factor, whatever that means, right? Maybe there were comorbidities that these diseases, you had obesity as a risk factor for cardiovascular diabetes, stroke, certain forms of cancer, maybe neurodegeneracy. It was a risk factor. But, as I'm digging into the science and the basic science, all of a sudden, it hits me that this is causal. It's in the causal chain. And then trying to understand the biology and what was it that was causal, that really was, that captured my interest. And, no doubt this starts, right? Bottom line, ultra-formulated foods are addictive. The GLP-1 drugs tamp down that addiction. In the end, though, you got to change your relationship with those ultra-formulated foods. You can't. I couldn't wait for the food environment to change. We've been at this, trying to change the food environment for decades. It may be viewed, I don't know if this is fair, just as tobacco was one of the great public health successes. Obesity, we can say, may have been one of the great public health failures. Am I overstating that? So. We've not done anything. So if you can't do anything about, to date, maybe there is some improvement, I think, in the food environment, right? But if you can't do anything about that food environment, I decided to write this book for the individual, because you can dramatically change your health, right? A few things, if this is causal, right? How do you dramatically change? How can you reclaim your health? Because I think in the end, the number that sticks in my head is the American body. I think it's fair. The rest of the world is following us, but the American body is ill. Right? Only 12.2% of us are metabolically healthy when you look at key parameters of blood pressure, blood lipids, blood glucose.
And David, there are a couple things I want to pull on that you just mentioned. In the last 10, 20 years, I think we have seen obesity and overweight levels rise in the country to staggering proportions. The majority of the country is now, and not a small majority, a large majority is overweight. We've also come to understand exactly what you said about this is not just extra weight we happen to carry around. It has direct consequences for disease, for heart disease, for diabetes, for other conditions that shorten both the quality of our lives as well as the quantity of our lives. But during that whole time, what you mentioned about the food environment, I think is exactly right. We have not made a lot of progress on helping people to address their weight. Now, I think when I was going through your book, what kept coming to mind for me were these stories of patients I had encountered in the hospital over the years, where I would talk to them about diet over the course of time. And usually when their experience went something like this. We had a conversation about their weight. They knew that they were overweight. They made certain commitments and decisions to change their diet. Those worked for some period of time. Sometimes it was only a week, sometimes it was a month. But inevitably, they found that it was hard to stick to that. They found that the weight ultimately came back. Sometimes it never left entirely. And they went through this cycle of beating themselves up and saying in our appointments together, I guess I need more willpower. I guess I just need to be stronger. And I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many people here know somebody in your life who's struggling with their weight? So almost all of us know someone, right? And this pattern and cycle may be familiar to you of people beating themselves up, saying and hearing all the messages that this is just about information, it's about willpower. But it is often felt to many of the patients I've cared for and the friends I've talked to who struggle with this, that there's something deeper at play, that it's not just about willpower, because they seem to exhibit extraordinary willpower in other dimensions of their life. Yet it seems hard when it comes to food. It almost seems like there's something in the food that is interacting with our body in a way that's generating what feels like an addictive relationship. So can you talk a little bit about this concept of food addiction? How do you see it? And what do you think it is about our food that seems to be contributing to this unhealthy relationship that we have?
I mean, you could see it most overtly, just on the question of willpower. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are now this class of drugs that shut down, quote, food noise. So by definition, if a drug's working on this, either directly or indirectly, that means it's biology, right? And there are biological circuits. So we can, I mean, if there is any issue of willpower, I think the question that is within our control is, do you want to do something about it, right? But the thing you can't do is to control these circuits alone, right? I mean, there are certain tools now you can use. Look, I mean, there are some great experts. I mean, in the room, I'm in awe. I mean, who lived through tobacco. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, and the key determinant of whether I mean, I think that that we saw that we lived, right, when we were inside Philip Morris, was the key test that FDA, DEA, NIDA used to determine whether something is addictive is the laboratory test is whether the drug is self-administered in laboratory, whether animals will press a lever. Right? And Jack Henningfield at NIDA, the great, nicotine expert, was teaching me about this stuff. And there were always these arms of the studies where they use sucrose, I mean, sort of as control. And I kept on saying to Jack, why are you using sucrose? And he never gave me a good answer. Right? I mean, the fact is, whether it's nicotine or these ultra-formulated components of food, right? It's fat, sugar, and salt. These are self-administered, mm-hmm. right? Both are self-administered. Now, I'm not talking about dopamine levels that are equivalent to amphetamine or cocaine, but both ultra-formulated foods and nicotine are psychoactive and can change how you feel. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think there is a continuum, of dysregulated eating. And food addiction is, maybe one, at one point of that spectrum. But there is no doubt, and I draw the distinction in the book between ultra-processed and ultra-formulated foods. Ultra-processed, to me, you think about stabilizers and emulsifiers and preservatives. The fact is, it's that perfect trifecta of, fat, sugar, and salt, fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt. I mean, that is self-administered, that people will, and animals will work for. And that gives you this what we found is, three clinical parameters: the sense of loss of control. I'm eating when I don't want to be eating. I'm eating in the absence of hunger. I just had dinner, and why am I still eating? Right? And then there's this lack of satiation. Right? I can't stop. I don't feel full. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the opening for these drugs. Right? And then there's this preoccupation with food, which is nothing more than what Ken Berridge and others have termed cue-induced wanting. Mm. Right? Which is, there's a cue, it's a time of day, it could be any kind of sensation or thought or trigger, right, that induces this wanting that gives rise to this preoccupation. It's 10 o'clock at night, you and I are still working. We have to prepare for tomorrow's briefing or whatever. I know I have 2-3 hours more, and I have this conversation in my head. I'm tired. I'm fatigued. I want to change how I feel. So I'm using something. To alter that emotional balance, that homeostatic balance. I need to get into 2-3 hours. Do I go down to the refrigerator? Do I not go down to the refrigerator? And then I have this. It's only when I try to deny myself that then I have this craving. So you have this cue-induced wanting. You have this craving, and then in the third part of addiction, you have this relapse. And then, why I'd lose my weight repeatedly. I'd gain the weight, I'd lose it. I'd do that over my lifetime. But when I lost it, I thought I was done, but I'd always gain it back. Yes, there's metabolic adaptation, but that's only part of the story. There are these reward circuits of the brain. That relapse is just weight regain. I still have those circuits there. I still have that environment. I'm still going to respond. Of course, I'm going to gain it back. Now, I think it's very important. You didn't ask the converse question. How many of you know people who have no issues with food whatsoever, for whom, right, food just does not, those are the people that I really want to study, right? Yeah. Because, I think that we have to redefine addiction in some ways. And I think this is key. Addiction is not about the weak or the downtrodden, right? I think addiction, if you go back thousands of years in an environment of scarcity, our brains evolved so that we would survive to find the most energy-dense foods. That's right. And you switch the environment from one of scarcity to abundance, you then have, it's not that our brains are not working well and something's wrong. Our brains are working too well. You just change all this energy-dense food. You take fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt, put it on every corner, make it available 24/7, make it socially acceptable to eat any time. What did you think was going to happen if our brains are wired to focus on the most energy-dense foods? Bingo. So those addictive circuits are just part of all of us, right? And it's that environment. It only comes out, right, when you try to stop that, right? And you try to, because the only way to deal with this, with this weight problem, is to go into an energy deficit, and that, by definition, is traditionally only meant you had to deprive yourself and you had to overcome these circuits, and you can't shut these circuits off. So what do, right? And that was the conundrum, yes. Right? That was the problem. And then you realize this is not about weight. Okay. Well, this really is not you. This is not how big you are or how small you are, right? The culprit here, right? What that food addiction, that dysregulated eating is driving, that overconsumption. I don't care that it's driving weight. I care that it's driving what I think, after really digging down, is what I call this toxic fat, right? And that's the fat in our midsection, this visceral adiposity, and that's the culprit.
So I'm glad you went there, because I think for many people this is new. Many people are used to thinking about BMI, which is the body mass index, composite of your height and weight, as a primary indicator that tells you whether you're in good shape or not. You're pointing to visceral fat, the collection of fat, around our midsection, that in fact tends to be more deadly. So can you speak, number one, a little bit more about why is visceral fat so bad? And second, for anyone out there who's thinking, how do I know if I'm in a danger zone or not? How should they measure visceral fat? What should they be talking to their doctors about?
So in fact, what is obesity? What is, is obesity just weight and a higher BMI? And that sort of got us off track, right? I think that was the mistake. The real question, the culprit is is when fat starts getting into your liver, fat gets into your pancreas, fat gets into layers of your heart. When those And I mean, in some ways, fat, I mean, in your legs and in your arms, if fat is holding on, this adipose tissue is holding on to all the free fatty acids and can keep them within, and they're doing their job within that cell and not be leaking those free fatty acids and those pro-inflammatory molecules out. I mean, fat in some ways can be protective because it can absorb all that fat. The problem is if you overwhelm those cells, right, and you release these free fatty acids and you release, these other chemicals from these fat cells, it is the accumulation, as you said. I mean, weight circumference is probably the best surrogate. Weight to height or weight to hip are both better measures than BMI. I mean, ultimately, percent body fat and where that measure of visceral fat, in your organs, around your organs, right? I mean, is what's literally killing us. I mean, we could dramatically change, the healthcare of this country if we can deal with visceral fat. Now, there are some. Those are the cardiometabolic effects. Now, there are certain, biomechanical aspects of obesity, effects on our hip, on our joints, where weight itself, is causing those biomechanical forces. But if you talk about cardiorenal, metabolic, neoplastic, neurological, it is, I'm convinced, this visceral adiposity, or ectopic fat, more precisely, fat in places where it shouldn't be, that is increasing this pro-inflammatory. That, if you look, not to get overly medical, but if you look at what these drugs do, this reduction in heart disease, it lowers the CRP, it lowers the inflammatory component. This visceral fat is identified, has its own abnormal lipid pattern of I'm sorry for doing the medical stuff, but it has hypertriglyceridemia associated, the decrease in HDL, the increase in non-HDL lipoproteins, and that plus those, that inflammatory plus this lipid pattern. I decrease visceral fat, in this country, you could probably reduce the healthcare budget by trillions of dollars a year. It's that straightforward. And I think all of a sudden the cardiologists, nephrologists, neurologists, or everybody's waking up and going, oh, I was treating my organ and I didn't realize it was this visceral adiposity, this ectopic fat getting into my organs, right? So that you have, in essence, a unifying aspect of disease that brings together all these medical specialists. Now, cardiologists still going, well, it's still a risk factor. I'm not ready to give up, right? But everyone's waking up to this central adiposity. And the reason I did the book was you can now do something about it if you want.
So let's go there to what we can do about it. And I want to spend some time talking about the GLP-1s. But before we get there, can you talk about what strategies you recommend for people before GLP-1s, things that they can do and take in their life if they want to follow the path you're talking about of renegotiating their relationship with food so they can ultimately help address visceral fat?
So we've had, I call it nutrition therapy, but it's really been diets, right? And there's been thousands and thousands of books written on diets, and they all work for a short period of time, and they all fail. It's sort of amazing, right? It is, but the problem with diets and nutrition therapy, even though nutrition is absolutely key to, to solving this, is it's that life preserver. When that experience when you're, in the water, you have a life preserver on, and you have it around you, and you're trying to hold it down underwater, and you can hold it down underwater for a certain period of time, but there are other forces at play, and those other forces are simply the addictive and metabolic circuits. They are always there in that environment. Yes, if you if you change our environment, if you take out all this ultra-formulated foods, right, it'll be easy to control those addictive circuits. But look, I mean, the fact is, if this ultra-formulated fat and sugar and salt is psychoactive, and the reality as human beings, I mean, just to get through the day, we have these blips. I mean, I was using food, I mean, to calm myself or to increase my cognitive focus. I mean, I wasn't using it just for fuel. I'm pretty sure if I were born 2-3 decades earlier, I would have been a smoker. I would have used nicotine in the same way to regulate my affect. So the question is, I mean, we told everybody to eat less and exercise more, and it was a complete failure. And the reason it doesn't work is you can't do it. You can do it for a short period of time. Some people can do it, right? Some people, you know, I mean, will be able to pull it off. But it's at a certain point, something happens in your life. I mean, you know, you lose that focus. You lose the ability to hold that life preserver down. And, you know, I mean, it would be great to get rid of those ultra-formulated foods to change the food environment. But now you have these drugs that come along that are one tool that can help you, you know, and what you know, I don't think the companies have fully leveled with the American people on how these drugs actually work, right? Some of my clinical friends who are doing the investigations, I mean, the trials on these drugs, they bristle when I say, you know, these are appetite suppressants. They think there's something magic about these pills. But once you realize that it is these addictive circuits that are driving the consumption, and those are part of all our brains, and yes, there's different, you know, degrees. We all have different, you know, how we're affected and how much we're affected by these ultra-formulated foods. But what's powerful enough to overcome those circuits? I mean, what is it that can tamp those circuits, right? You know, we've seen other drugs in the past, fen, for example. I mean, basically it was amphetamines. I mean, it revs up the circuit, so amphetamines can drive down those circuits. but the way I think these drugs work is that they keep food in your stomach longer. Food just doesn't move along as fast, and so it delays gastric emptying. I mean, understand whether it's diet, drugs, or surgery, the only way to reduce this visceral adiposity, I mean, or reduce, you know, weight, which is both visceral adiposity, you know, adiposity as well as muscle mass. I mean, that's the only way to do that. I mean, is to eat less, but you can't do that because you have these addictive circuits. So you got to tamp down those addictive circuits. So if you keep food in your stomach longer, I mean, we've all experienced this. We've had the flu, right? And when you have the flu, what don't you want to do? You don't want to put anything else in your stomach. Why not? Because food's staying in your stomach. And so what the drug companies have tapped into is this spectrum. There's this spectrum of, you know, of satisfaction. When you eat, there's satisfaction, right? There's satiety, there's fullness, there's Thanksgiving degree fullness, right? And then I can push you to, you know, I keep food in your stomach longer, I can push you to the edge of nausea. And then if I put too much food in your stomach, I'll tip you over into more avert GI distress. So what these drugs are doing is it's just keeping food in your stomach longer. Yes, I mean, there is, the way that works is these drugs work on the hindbrain, right? I mean, there's the area of postrema, and they work on the gut. Those are part of the aversive circuits that our bodies have to deal with food poisons, as opposed to the reward circuits. So that the drug companies have figured out how to tap into that aversive circuits, and that aversive circuit, by keeping food in your stomach, taking you to that edge of nausea, that balances the rewards pathways, so it tamps down the food noise, and you go, oh, you know, I don't want it as much. Now, the trick is, the problem, is these drugs only work while you're on them. Right? And the companies, the premise, they sold these drugs to the FDA is you have to stay on these drugs for a life. Right? But the reality is, if you look at the data, people are on these drugs for 8 to 9 months. Right? And then they go off it, whether they're too expensive, they don't have insurance coverage, they can't tolerate them, they don't want the drug burden. So what's going to happen is that people will lose the weight, spend thousands of dollars, go off the drugs in 8, 9 months, and then in 3, 4 years, we're going to realize everyone's going to gain back the weight. And this is going to be one big failure we're going to look at. So the real trick, what the companies have to do, and what the FDA has to urge the companies to do, is to get data of can you go off these drugs? Can you use that experience while you're on these drugs to relearn your relationship with food? Okay. Can you eat? I mean, what I found when I went on these drugs is that I would eat very differently. I would eat very small amounts. I would, I wouldn't want to put, fat and sugar in my stomach. I mean, and keep it in my stomach because I would feel ill. So I changed what I wanted to eat. And the question is, can you use that experience to carry over when you're off the drugs? Or, I mean, these tools. What's absolutely essential is, yes, we can change our health dramatically. I mean, we reduce waist circumference, right? I mean, and again, different groups, that number is different. Because that visceral fat leads to hyperinsulinemia, and and that also is part of that vicious cycle. But you can dramatically reduce, change your health. But you have to use these, if you want to use these drugs, and there shouldn't be any shame, just because I was not born with the society hormones that somebody else, or because I have less GLP, one naturally, or I have less PYY, or I have more ghrelin. There's nothing that it should be embarrassing stigma. So to use those drugs, but you can't use you can't deal with these reward circuits alone. You need to do it under good care. You need a good dietitian. You need a good doc. You need a doc who's trained in this. But if we can figure this out, if we can put this together, I mean, it's probably the most profound. I mean, it's as big as tobacco.
So I have a couple more questions on GLP, but looking at the time, I want to make sure we get a few questions in first. So let me come to the audience and see. Let's take a few questions right back here. Go ahead, ma'am.
My name's Pat Gosley. I'm an artist. I'm affiliated with myself. You mentioned circuitry, and what does this have to do with, like, Candace Pert's research on the opioid receptors and molecules of emotion? Seems like you're leaving emotion out of it. And you didn't really talk about anything about alternative approaches. Like, I know several people who've quit smoking with acupuncture, with needles in their ears. So I get this feeling that you're totally leaving emotion out of it, and any alternative circuitry, like traditional Chinese medicine.
I mean, thanks for the question. I apologize if I do that. I am talking about the emotional. This is the emotional circuitry of the brain. We can. I mean, how much of this is dopamine? How much of this is opioid? How much is the endorphins? I mean, this is the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. This is the emotional regulatory system. I mean, the nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area. This is the heart of emotional regulation. We are wired to focus on the most salient stimuli environment. For many of us, that's highly palatable, NAG-dense, highly processed, ultra-formulated foods, but not all of us. I mean, so we get captured by the most salient stimuli, and there are many different ways to try to tamp down that emotional regulation. But what you're seeing is that for decades, we failed to tamp down those. I mean, we haven't given people the tools. All of a sudden, now you have these drugs that are highly effective that take you to the edge of nausea, and people go, "Oh, I now don't have food noise." Right? I mean, and that's that incessant nagging of focusing our attention, focusing our emotional circuits. I mean, on those salient stimuli. So I think, in some ways, the GLP-1s are teaching us about. I mean, they're at the core of the emotional brain.
And David, just are there other modalities that you have seen data for that may be effective in certain populations, whether it's acupuncture, like you mentioned, or other modalities?
So the modality that's probably the most, I mean, if you look at tobacco, what worked, right? So you're dealing with, nicotine that also through that circuitry, through that, acetylcholine part of that circuitry, certainly was able to trigger that same emotional core of that brain. And in the end, when you're dealing with something that triggers that, I will call it those addictive circuits, right? I mean, what did the tobacco industry try to do at the turn of the prior century, right? I mean, they took a psychoactive substance and they made it widely available, but they also, they hired the psychoanalyst A.A. Brill to equate tobacco with, the symbols of freedom, torches of liberty, the emancipation. They made, tobacco, certainly in our parents' and grandparents' generation, it was sexy, cool, the Marlboro Man. They made it positively valence. What did we do? I mean, a number of you in this room, all right? I mean, Chairman Waxman, bestseller, Bill Core, Bill Shaw. I mean, in this room, some of the great tobacco figures. What did you do, right? I mean, we demonized the tobacco industry. We changed that nicotine from something that was positively valenced, right? There was this critical perceptual shift in society that we changed it from positively valenced to negatively valenced. We made people perceive it. I mean, if it's positively valenced, I want it, I need it, it's my friend. If I demonize it, it's a deadly, disgusting habit, I want to stay away from it. So the last 75 years, it's chipping away of chapters. Right? We changed something from positively valence to negative valence because we had this critical perceptual shift of this. So now the problem again is not, just as it's not weight, it's visceral adiposity. The problem is not food, it's this ultra-formulated foods that where this fat, sugar, and salt has been concentrated. All the structure that slows down eating has been taken away, so that you have these ultra-formulated foods triggering our brains and also overwhelming our metabolism, causing hyperinsulinemia, causing this visceral adiposity. It would be great if we as a society looked at the central aisles of the foods, the supermarkets, and say, hey, we don't want that stuff, right? But that's what has to happen. There has to be that critical perceptual shift in society. The fact is, I mean, it's very powerful. It still can change how you feel, right? But until you perceive it as the enemy, as something you don't want, and what all the drug companies are doing is that they're making you, they're pushing you to the edge of nausea. So if you're at the edge of nausea, you're not going to want something. I mean, there's no magic.
Let's take a few more questions. Check him out.
Oh, here's the mic.
Just wanted to add to this, what this woman was saying about emotion. I'm a psychologist, and I've treated patients with obesity, and behind it all that I've found is that they were so deprived as children that they didn't get the comfort and love that they needed, and food replaced it. So they used food to calm themselves down, to make them feel better, going back to feelings. And I think that's a huge part of it.
So the last person I would, can I defend my mother a little? Right? I mean, I don't think I was deprived as a kid. I mean, well, so how hard is it to deal with weight? Very hard. I mean, do you have the answer? No. Right. Right. So with all therapy, I mean, and understand, if we're gonna, I mean, if you're gonna do, if you look at these drugs, you should look at them as one tool with nutrition therapy, with behavior therapy, right, with physical activity, because you're not going to be on these drugs, chances are, for your whole life. Maybe a few will be, and you need that range of tools, right? And if you put it together, but I would use food. I mean, it was 10 o'clock at night, and I needed to work 3-4 hours more. I wanted to keep my cognitive focus. I needed to keep my energy low. I would give me that food, I could work another 2-3 hours, right? I mean, it would literally change my cognitive focus. right? I don't think it was a lack of love. I think it's the fact that we are, throughout the day, and night, we have these emotionals up and down that take us out of this homeostatic, this part of the species. It's how we respond and how we viscerally process stimuli. The food is just very powerful, and I was using that and not for fuel.
Other questions? Right here, sir.
Hi, I'm Ray Suarez. I'm a reporter.
The Ray Suarez.
I was just wondering, and you've both been government officials and maybe touched on this, what greets an American shopper when they walk into a grocery store is in part affected by politics and economics. There's a tremendous lobby for the overproduction of corn, a lot of which gets shuttled into high fructose corn syrup. It's a much bigger lobby than the senators from tobacco that you wrestled with when you were at FDA. How much are we working at cross purposes, suppressing the import of cane sugar for Michigan sugar beet farmers, incentivizing the growth of corn, making commodity cheese so cheap that big national pizza chains reduce the price of their pie while adding more cheese and leading their ads with that? How much is politics and the way our food production responds to politics a part of this problem?
It's the whole thing. The issue is, can I wait for that people to change that, or am I going to protect myself? Now, let me give you one other piece of the biology. Sorry, we talked about the addictive circuits. We talked about toxic fat. Let me just give you this one other set of circuits. We talked about the aversive circuits that shut down the addictive circuits that can affect the visceral adiposity. Let me just give you one other piece of the puzzle, right? What we did in the 1930s and 1940s, what food production did, was the shift to shelf stable, to be able to ship food over long distance. Okay? It basically had to make food that shelf life had to be extended so food didn't spoil, right? And you ever wonder why that food in your pantry can stay there for 2 months or 3 months or 8 months and still exist? It basically took out the hydration, right? Certainly they did add preservatives, but along the way, that ultra formulated, that ultra processed food, the key ingredient to that, right? If you look at the middle aisles are some kind of starch, flour, sucre. It's the first or second ingredient, and what we did in processing is you look at the blueberry, look at a perfect, something that occurs in nature. It has structure, it has fiber, it has yes, there's some glucose and and sweetness there, but it's held within the structure of the food. The food industry basically in processing removed all that structure and just concentrated the starch, the flour that gets broken down very rapidly in the gut, right? Again, it enhances gastric empty, which means it gets rapidly absorbed into the GI tract, through the GI tract into the bloodstream. There is an epidemic, and no one's paid attention to it, of hyperinsulinemia in this country. No, docs don't measure insulin levels, they measure glucose levels. The reason why glucose levels, yes, people go, oh, my glucose is out of control. But if you really, what's keeping the American glucose level even in control is that our insulin levels are working harder and harder, and in some of us that burns out our pancreas. But there is an epidemic of hyperinsulinemia, and that insulin itself is pro-inflammatory, right? And at the essence of that are these rapidly absorbable carbohydrates. Right? And we just are using that to that's overwhelming our metabolic. So we have these addictive circuits, we have these aversive circuits. We're pouring in processed foods that are increasing these overwhelming our metabolic circuits. That's why we're so ill as a country.
Yeah, well, let me take you here in the second row.
Hi, David. I'm Sari Hurwitz,
Go from one great reporter to another great reporter.
but unaffiliated at the moment. Two-part question. What is your experience and the experience of talking to the experts about going off these drugs, but then going back on them, the safety of going on and off over a lifetime? And then the other thing is, could you talk a little bit more about your personal journey going from eating a lot at night when working together for your cognitive ability improvement to then going on these drugs? Like, what was it like for you? What did you go through? When you talk about going to the point of nausea, like, what is that? Can you kind of give us a sense of that?
So, we're living in the wild. FDA put these drugs out under the pretext that they'd be used for, life, and the reality is that people are, not on these drugs for more than 8-9 months. The majority of people. Some will stay on for life, but my sense is very, very few are.
And David, is that because of cost or side effects, or what's driving this?
Yes, and yes. All those are reason. People don't want to be continued drug burden, but yes, they can't afford these. They don't want to inject. They can't tolerate this. They don't want to have that edge of nausea. When these drugs were first given in laboratory animals, sorry about that. When Dan Drucker did the first set of experiments on the predecessor molecules, injected this into laboratory animals, now again, be careful on the doses, these animals didn't move, right? And they coined this term visceral malaise, right? This generalized sickness associated with these drugs, right? But I am humbled because we all react differently to drugs. We all react differently to these ultra-formulated foods. So there is great variability. So taking me to the edge of nausea, other people will go, hey, I take these drugs and I don't feel anything. Some people, I can't tolerate this. I can't stay on these drugs, right? Because it's not just taking to the edge of nausea, meaning it's overt GI distress that they're experiencing. But we don't know whether it is safe to go off these drugs, right? And go back on them. We don't know whether the drugs will continue to work. We don't know at what doses you should do that at, right? And we certainly don't have a strategy. There is no end game if you go on these drugs. If you go on these drugs, what's the end game? You're going to be on these for life? You shouldn't go on these drugs. And there's no one tool that's going to always work. I would do this diet. I'll do that diet. I'll do this behavioral change, right? But eventually I get bored and go, and I can only hold that life preserver down. So you have to have a range of tools, right? But that's why, if you can't do this yourself. If you have help, healthcare is, sorry in this audience, but healthcare is so broken in the United States. Let's just say, just realize what happened here. On these drugs. Let me just do the economics for a second. The companies, price these drugs. I think it's fair to say they price these drugs, if not excessively, certainly they are very expensive, right? I carry 3 different health insurance plans, and none of them cover these drugs. These drugs cost me over $1,000 a month, right? But imagine having now, you struggled your whole weight, you're ill, you have cardiac disease, you're at risk, right? You have now something that potentially could work. It's not the be all or end all, and you can't afford it. So there is this, I don't know, again, the experts in the room, compounding. It's a loophole in the law. It's allowed under the FDA Act, right? It's this gray area. It was done for certain reasons and done for certain shortages. the FDA experts, can answer that question. Compounded drugs got on the market, and where were the compounding drugs coming from? Well, they were coming from somewhere in some Chinese factories that no one really, yes, sometimes they were investigated, sometimes they were registered, but there was no reference standard to what those drugs should be to decide what the chemical entities were. And you had national telehealth companies selling these drugs now, not at 1,000, but 200. So people who wanted access to these drugs had to, in this country, their only option was to go to drugs for who the safety was not assured. There's something wrong with that picture. And then the brand name companies go, oh, now we have to start competing with the compounding drugs. So they start reducing their price. But the commercial insurance and the PBMs are not, the system is still screwed up. And no one has, provided access to these drugs. What happens when you go off them? Once you go off these drugs, I said to one of the investigators, what happens when you take your patients off? She said, it's what keeps me up at night because their appetite comes back voraciously, right? So you have to have, again, it has to be done under good care. You have to have other therapies that you can put in place if you want to go off that. I think there's a way to control this for the long term. That's what obesity medicine, this whole specialty is about. That's what dietitians do. You have to have different tools, but at least you have a tool. For me, I go on the drugs, I can, I get to that edge of nausea. I condition how I eat. I can go off these drugs for a period of time. The president of the Obesity Medicine Society, comes out and says, hey, I've been on these, I've been taking these drugs intermittently for 10 years. That's not part of the approved label. FDA got to get, their act together, and how we can use it. But if I go off these drugs, I control my weight, and as soon as my weight starts going back, do I need to get another, go back on to again condition my relationship with food? But I need a strategy of what my diet should be. We got to figure out the dietary guidelines. Dietary guidelines are written for an America that doesn't exist. It's written for people who are healthy. The majority of Americans are hyperinsulinemic, and we have to recognize that those guidelines need to be revised.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so let's just do one last question there in the back. Yes, you may. Yeah.
Hi, Debbie Ross, unaffiliated. I wonder if when you're on the Ozempic, if you feel like you are in control of what you eat.
So let's just be careful. Let's just go through the names. I don't mean to be. So there's Ozempic is the Novo Nordisk drug for diabetes, right? The equivalent of that is Mounjaro, the Lilly drug. The weight loss drugs are Wegovy, Novo, and Zepbound. So there's 4 different, right? And I specifically, no one in this town has ever accused me of shilling for the pharmaceutical industry, and I don't favor one, over the other. Although the data show that Zepbound is more powerful. The question was,
Do you feel like you're in control?
If you push me to the edge of nausea, I have less food noise. I guess that's an existential question. If I have to be at the edge of nausea, am I in greater control? Yeah, I guess yes. Look, ultimately, there's something wrong with this picture. You have one industry that's making billions of dollars making us sick. You have another industry that is now making, equal profits to reverse what that former industry is doing to us. If you were from Mars and you came down and you looked at that problem and you looked at this country, you would say there's something wrong with this picture. Fix the underlying problem. But until you do that, I think these drugs are a tool, have to be used under good control. Yes. Am I in more control of my health? Absolutely. I have reduced my percent body fat in half, right? And if you do that, virtually all metabolic parameters just improve because it's causal. So I am in control of my health. Am I in control of my appetite? I mean, day by day, right? I mean, yes, maybe today, tomorrow, I can't promise you.
Thank you, David. I know we're just about at time. This issue is not going away. This is going to continue to be in the public discussion. And as David mentioned, it's because of forces that are driving this challenge we have with overweight and obesity have not been changed fundamentally in terms of our food supply, in terms of the percentage of our diet that is ultra-processed foods, which is, by the way, much higher among kids than it is among adults. So we've got a lot to do even at the early stages of life. But I want to just make one comment about David. You know, there are some people who are public servants because of the job that they hold. Maybe they're an elected official, like Congressman Waxman, maybe they served in appointed positions. There are others who are public servants because of their DNA. And that's David Kessler. Whether he's been in government or not, he's always found a way to serve and to address important public health needs. I got a chance to see that at the early stages of my career in medicine, as a student. And if you watch his career, whether he's been inside or outside government, he's been at the forefront of trying to address deep, intractable problems. If you wanted to write a simple book, you would not write the book David wrote, because it's complicated, but it's exactly those kind of issues that we need somebody to step forward and to try to look at everything that's out there, the data, the anecdotes, the stories, and all the forces that are creating this problem and help us make sense of it. And that's what David has masterfully and beautifully done in this book. So I just want to thank all of you for being here, for participating in this. If you haven't gotten a copy of the book, please do. If you have gotten a copy, please get a second one for a friend, because I guarantee you that this is an issue that many people in our social circles are contending with. I want to thank Ruth and the Aspen Institute for hosting us today, and Ruth in particular, just for her years of friendship to both of us, and for supporting this incredible work. And finally, and most importantly, I want to thank David and Paulette and the family for giving this beautiful session to us today, and for all the work you're continuing to do. David has been on sort of blanketing the airwaves over the last few weeks, talking about this issue in this book. And there's a lot, for those of you who may not be paying attention, there's a lot happening in the news right now. But to be able to break through and to have all of these interviews and have all these conversations that David is having in the media speaks to both his power and his influence as a public health leader, but also to the importance of this issue. So I'm so glad that you've taken this on, David, and thank you again for blessing us today with this wonderful conversation.
And especially, it's very special. Thank you for doing this.
Oh,
I mean, it's
a treat.
very, meant a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you all for being here. David's book is for sale right outside, and he has promised to stick around and do some signings for those of you who are interested. Thank you again for everybody.